Alright guys, welcome back. GM Light here. If you've been following my channel for the last couple months, I've been reviewing the Final Destination movies in preparation for Bloodlines coming out. So I thought that what would be nice to do is kind of compile all my reviews into one big retrospective where I just go through the movies one by one. So for reference, if you watched my other reviews, this is just a compilation of all of them. This isn't really anything new besides this opening, but I thought it would be nice to compile them all into one. But I also think that you need that context of the fact that I reviewed them all as separate videos, not just kind of one retrospective, because I'm sure that I make repetitious points throughout each of them in the context of I reviewed them different days. So I'm bringing up points that I brought up before. You know, obviously my clothes are different, stuff like that. Things that only make sense in the context of I reviewed each movie separately over the course of months and made them separate videos. But without further ado, I provide for you my full franchise retrospective of the first 5 Final Destination movies. So let's kick it off. This might be a controversial take, I don't know, but in a lot of ways I would consider the first Final Destination movie to be the quintessential early 2000s horror movie. I especially have a lot of nostalgia with those first 3 Final Destination movies. I feel like they would air them all the time on the Sci-Fi Channel, and I remember just having a lot of fond memories of watching them on the TV, getting irrational fears because of it. You know, it's one of those things where it makes you watch everything you do and be paranoid about certain things that you wouldn't ordinarily be. So this is definitely one of those nostalgic movies, and that probably colors my opinion a little bit of this, but I still feel like it deserves a lot of credit for how inventive it kind of is. I feel like the mechanics of the movie are very interesting, and I feel like that's what it really brings to the horror genre. And the weird thing is that this movie really does strike such an interesting balance. It really does have that overarching dread leading up to that premonition. It shows why we should feel afraid, and they have a bit of that uneasiness that it kind of injects into the story. And it genuinely does a good job of making death feel like such an inevitability to the characters, and ultimately making it feel like something that just cannot be escaped. But despite how morbid and even kind of depressing the movie can be, and how depressing and morbid these themes are, it actually still keeps a lot of fun on the forefront. I think that that is what makes these movies so watchable to me, is that although they do have that heaviness to them, they deal with death obviously a lot. Death is the overarching, unflinching force that pursues the characters. There's still a lot of fun in these movies. I think that that's what makes them so kind of easy to watch. They're all 90 minutes about, so very much putting it in that camp of this is a very fun early 2000s horror movie. And also made it so that it wasn't way too intense for me to experience as a kid. You can tell too in the way that they set up and pay off these kill scenes. They were at least going for a level of absurdity, and that doesn't take away from the tension of these scenes. They very much have that whole thing going on of ratcheting up the tension, kind of building it up. You feel the tightening of the rope, and everything that the characters do, every decision that they make, and every obstacle that they have to overcome to evade death, and just them not knowing, I think, really adds to that. That is the balance. That's what I'm talking about when I say that, because it really does even things out when you're dealing with death and these subjects. The fact that we have some of that fun, some of that absurdity, it adds a little bit of levity to it that at least cuts down those darker elements. This movie probably could be, or could have been, a very dark, very overarching and depressing movie. I mean, the movie begins with kind of a brutal scene of a plane blowing up. That's heavy. And the sequels kind of do away with how heavy that initial scene is. It feels like they set up more of fun centerpieces later on in the series. But this movie does still, you know, keep things back in the center. They don't overdo it with either the comedy or with the darkness. And those are definitely for some of the movies that I appreciate most of the horror genre, because a lot of the ones that I do like are those ones that strike a balance, and while you're having fun, they're also dealing with these things. You know, Chucky, Terrifier, the Nightmare on Elm Street movies, Get Out, they have a bit of levity that makes it so that although the themes are very much present and they're not overtaken, there's just a little bit of levity to cut the tension. I also think that this movie has very unmistakable early 2000s charm. You got stars like Sean William Scott, you got Devon Sawa. Those guys are just always fun to watch in anything they're in. I still appreciate, you know, all these years later seeing Devon Sawa pop up in movies. And then Sean William Scott, although he hasn't really moved past his Stifler role, obviously, he's always just a delight. The American Pie movies are some of my favorites, a staple of the late 90s and early 2000s. So it's good to see him in another kind of role that's atypical for him, but once again, just another familiar face pace that you'll love to see in an early 2000s movie. But I guess kind of what is a little bit more mixed on this one versus some of the other movies, and it's just that I don't think that the kills are as memorable in this one as they are in later movies. But you also have to remember that this is the one that's establishing this concept, so things are a little bit more bare bones. They're still a bit more basic because this isn't a franchise yet. It's just more of the ultimate delivery of the movie is about providing you this concept rather than getting elaborate with it like the later movies do, because obviously once the later movies come, they have to be more elaborate in order to set themselves apart. This is just the bare concept of it, and it's establishing what kind of becomes the norms of what would become a franchise. So it's a bit more basic. These kills aren't as intricate. I think that the better ones come later. It's just because of that, you know, I don't think that this ultimate setup with the plane, most of the kills stick out in my mind as much when I think about this franchise compared to the second movie or the fifth movie. The ones later on I think add a bit more and are just a bit tonally different, but it's also too they just go for something else because they have the added pressure of continuing the franchise, topping it, doing things differently from the previous movie or movies. This one doesn't have that pressure because it is just trying to deliver this story. Although I think it makes it work as a first entry, it just makes it a bit less memorable in that department. Overall though, that is some of the better nature of the movie. It's a bit more subdued, and like I said, this is the movie that establishes that formula. You gotta give it credit for the fact that it is setting up the bedrock for what comes later in this franchise. Although I think some of the entries later on do a better job overall and I enjoy them more, you still have to give that first one credit because it's the one that made it. It's just the fact that the later movies capitalize on it that makes them stick out more to me. But this movie is extremely clever and original though. You have to think about it in the context of the early 2000s when they're making this first movie and they come out with it. This movie would have blown me away if I was like 0 or 1. But this movie totally would have blown me away if I saw it in theaters. If I were to go see a movie today with this level of inventiveness, I would love it. I'd be all over it. And I think that this really shows why it had staying power in the first place. Although I know that there is kind of a precedent for this whole kind of, schemish thing of one thing sets up another thing and then other things happen, I forget the name for it, but there is something that pre-established it. I think it was more of a comedic thing, but I still feel like this movie is extremely influential, especially in the horror genre, for using that for horror purposes. Although the style of deaths, kind of the premonition type thing, they're a little similar to The Omen in terms of these accidents. I really think that this is the franchise that made that type of kill scene a thing. Also, to the idea of not having this killer be a physical presence, I think is, although not entirely original, I think very outside of the box because they almost use him as a physical presence like a slasher, but they have him conduct it through other means, and it's awesome. It's just a bit outside the box because it's not entirely a slasher movie, but it's also definitely not a haunting movie, I wouldn't say. It kind of mashes them together and it almost feels like this movie creates a new subgenre because it really does feel like a slasher movie packaged as almost this haunting movie, while neither being really either. It's an early 2000s movie. Some stuff ages a bit poorly, and it can get a bit confusing when trying to pull out the rug from under you by getting muddled with all these different amendments to how this whole thing works, all the stuff with the order of the deaths. But overall, it's cool. It's a great movie. I see why it would spawn 5 sequels and why 25 years later they would still be trying to bring this franchise back to milk another ticket out of me, which it's gonna get. But it sets the premise, it sets the mechanics of this franchise, and it walks so that the sequels can run. And I'll always give it credit for that. But those are just my thoughts on the first Final Destination movie. Let me know what you guys think in the comment section. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Are you excited for Bloodlines? Never a good sign. Pet Sematary Bloodlines really burned me, so I'm not a fan of that subtitle, but I don't know, it makes total sense for this. I feel like when I talk about the Final Destination franchise, the second one is the most popular answer to me of the people's favorite. Feels like the one that people bring up the most. They bring up the log truck. They bring up the very memorable parts of this movie because I think that it's the one that pops the most. And for good reason too. I think it's the most memorable one probably. It's just more flashy. It has a more iconic kind of opening set piece. The traffic pileup is awesome. It's a lot more flashy than the first one, I think. And it's definitely remembered for the kills because this has some of the best ones and some of the best executed. I'd say this is probably the furthest they get pushed, where the boundaries are very much at a secure level. They don't take it too far, they don't go too cartoonish, but they also make them pretty wild. They're insane, they're cringy, but they're not ridiculous or laughable in the way that some of the ones in 3 and 4 are. They're obviously insane and very unfortunate, but like I said, I feel like in especially 3 and 4, they have to convolute their way into having these deaths, and these are just the right amount of fun and relatable cringe that just, makes you nervous. The tension is built correctly. You have these situations that are very possible, very vulnerable, could easily happen in a lot of cases. But I also think that they, in a lot of ways, subvert your expectations when they have these things happen, because it's generally not the most obvious method of death that comes to these characters. It's usually the one thing that they weren't paying attention to that slinks its way around and gets you in the end. And that's why this movie is so badass. That's why it's so enjoyable. That's why I think that these are the kills that are remembered the most. It is the most memorable of these movies, I would say. It's sure as hell the one that played on TV the most. I remember watching this movie all the time on TV. This was a top tier movie to watch in 2008 on the Sci-Fi Channel. I feel like everybody thinks of this movie when they drive behind a log truck at this point, because that imagery has become so synonymous with Final Destination 2. And even just beyond all that superficial stuff, which that's what you come to this franchise for, because you're looking for fun and inventive kills that push boundaries, are exciting, you're looking for that tension and that terror when you come to a Final Destination movie. But, it pops a bit more, and it also tries to add a little bit more of the way of rules and lore to Death's design and the way that this whole thing works, which you kind of have to do. It's a really interesting concept, this idea of new life kind of subverting death. That's a good rule to have. It also provides a little bit of hope. The way that you're left with that first movie is that you think they beat it by having them skip the order, only to find out in the end death comes to you anyway. And that's a little bit depressing. I think that there's a bit more stakes in the movie if you feel like they have hope of actually subverting death or a way to potentially evade it, and having this plot device, this new rule introduced that new life could bring about thwarting death because it's, restoring the balance to the design. It just sets up things in a way to where there's a ticking time clock. There's this added tension and pressure of saving this woman, staying alive in the meantime, and avoiding every possible horrible situation that will inevitably happen when you're out in the real world. Obviously, this rule would be later nullified by the existence of Final Destination Bloodlines, which introduces the concept of death coming after people's children because they survived and then they go on to have this bloodline. Death is coming to collect a bloodline that never should have been. But I feel like you gotta hold that more against Bloodline, obviously, because that's the movie, the sequel that is coming subsequently after and is rewriting the rules, rather than Final Destination 2, which was made 20 years before this sequel that writers wouldn't know would undo the rules and just contradict things 2 decades later. But another thing I think makes this sequel stand out as opposed to the rest of the sequels in this franchise, and in the context of these movies, it's interesting that we have Clear back. This is the only time that a Final Destination movie has brought a surviving character back. I mean, obviously you have William Bloodworth, Tony Todd, rest in peace, throughout these movies, but he's not a survivor. He's more of the arbiter of death. He's the guy who tells the characters what's going on and gives them the exposition they need to figure things out. I don't really consider him because he's like I said, he's not someone who survived death, but he kind of is the manifestation of it. But I do enjoy when in a horror franchise's continuity they bring back a returning character or survivor. I just like when stories are built that way and you have that level of pulling things forward. Fortunately, like every horror franchise kills off returning characters and survivors, and this one is no exception, but I still appreciate it when they do it, and there's a benefit to bringing her back in this movie. Even though she sort of just gets wasted by the end of the movie, I still like that she brought a level of progression to the story. A franchise like this, and we see this later on, tends to spin its wheels, and having her back, explaining the rules and everything that's going on, cuts down the need to just have a fresh set of characters where they have to figure everything out all over again because they don't know the rules sequels. They don't have to figure out Death's design because she knows it, so just get to the new shit. Can cut down on all that other stuff that we learned before. Whereas the first movie had them slowly figuring this out, the order, ways to potentially evade death, and kind of that ultimate futility that eventually becomes clear. This movie just gets right to the action, and with Clear's presence, with all of the poppy deaths and everything, it just feels like it's pure, unadulterated Final Destination. First one walked so that this one could run. Some of my complaints about the movie, like I said, I just don't love it when a character survives only to be killed in the sequel. And the thing is, they don't only just do that to Clear. I kind of hate that they just had Alex die off screen. He got hit by a falling brick in between movies, apparently, which is a little bit ridiculous, but okay, they couldn't get Devon Sawa back, I get it. But I'm not going to pretend that this isn't a movie that I totally dig, though. I find it just so entertaining, so classic. It's very rewatchable. I'd say a lot more rewatchable than the first movie, even though I do like that first movie quite a bit. I also think that it nails a lot of the practicality with these deaths that the CGI starts to take over in the subsequent movies. But it's just in general exciting. It's so solid, and just roundabout just continues to build off of the strength of that first one and take it to new territory in this second movie. It's hard to find and criticize parts about this movie because I like it so much, because it's so entertaining. But those are just my thoughts. As I've mentioned many times before, I grew up being a huge fan of the Final Destination movies, especially the first three. As a kid who grew up in the early 2000s, these just felt like a staple of movies I would catch on the Sci-Fi Channel all the time, and I've been covering them and rewatching them and very much enjoying re-experiencing this series. And now we're getting to Final Destination 3, and although I still very much enjoy this movie, it very much feels like the first complacent sequel in this franchise. It feels like especially this is the first time that the formula kind of gets a bit tiring. 2 was able to distance itself a little bit by the fact that they brought back this returning character of Clear who could kind of just cut the bullshit and answer the questions without it just being a rehash of the first movie, of the characters just slowly figuring out what they can do, what's going on, and what Death's design is and what order they're gonna die. They were able to just kind of jump to a new concept. The stuff with bringing new life into the equation, and also even just that forward momentum of having a returning character back. But this one doesn't have returning characters. This one doesn't have William Bloodworth to kind of, do his usual thing that I think adds such a great charm to the first two. And it just puts it on kind of a lower level than those first two, despite the fact that I still very much like it and find it entertaining. And when I say that, it doesn't necessarily make any giant mistakes. It sure as hell doesn't make any of the giant mistakes that the fourth movie makes. It doesn't have any embarrassing moments like that movie does. But this truly felt like the first sequel that was just complacent with doing the regular formula of this franchise. But I do have positives. I really do like the roller coaster idea. I think that's a great idea for a sequence, and the setup is just classic Final Destination. But I still can't help but feel like the movie overall is just the least distinct visually, I would say. Even with how bad some of the missteps are of Final Destination 4, and I don't think that it's for the better, but it definitely does have a much more visually distinct look and identity than 3 does from the first two. I think that 3 very much just feels like the first two. It feels like it looks visually like it, whereas 4 is it's a lot worse. It looks a lot worse, and it has that CGI shit going on. But it does look different, and I don't think that 3 kind of does that, and that's kind of why it gets lost in the pile of the first 3. For better or worse, this just kind of looks like the first two, and is very much a visual continuation of that. And it kind of makes sense because the director of the first movie is the one who came back for this one, but it just doesn't feel like he introduces enough new concepts. And I genuinely am not trying to sound this harsh and bash on this movie too much, because I do genuinely like it. I think it's a very easy movie to throw on, especially when I'm marathoning these. And I really do pretty much enjoy all the movies in this franchise to at least a certain degree. Even the bad ones I enjoy. Especially too, like I said, when you're binging these movies, I just find 3 very incredibly easy to just roll into after watching the first two. But this felt like the most generic cast of characters so far in this franchise. And it didn't move the needle enough, in my opinion, in terms of the story or the lore with this franchise or these these movies, despite the fact that it is incredibly watchable. Great kills, very fun premonition and setup. I love the idea of being locked into the roller coaster, and just that freaky idea of trying to hang on. I find that really incredibly compelling, scary. This reminds me of the story that my dad told me about when he was on a roller coaster and the thing wouldn't go down, and he basically had to like have a total meltdown in order to get the person to stop it before it was too late. That's incredibly freaky. The idea of the things falling off and hanging on and going around these loops, that's total nightmare fuel. And again, it doesn't make nearly as many of the offensive mistakes that the fourth movie makes. In terms of acting, characters, CGI, all that stuff is miles better than fourth movie. I think the thing I really remembered about this movie is Mary Elizabeth Winstead. She's great. She's pretty great in every movie she's in, and this is no exception. She does a great job leading this movie. And I feel like I also really remembered the amusement park imagery. I love because it's so good at kind of perverting childhood imagery, things that should be fun, things that should be carefree, but turning them on their heads and making them terrifying and using them to scare the audience, I find incredibly effective. They also do dive into a few things that I appreciated. They definitely focus a lot more on the omens of death in this movie and some of the uncertainty associated with the afterlife, some of the justice associated with death and the unfairness. But still though, at the end of the day, I can't give it too much credit because it's just another set of characters piecing together information that we know because we've seen it twice before. To my knowledge, it feels like the only thing that this movie really adds is the picture concept of foreshadowing death. That just feels like the only kind of new addition or anything that can be added to the lore and the rules of death's design. And that's a bit disappointing because I just think 2 does so many more things in order to escalate that and to give those characters hope. I mean, the picture idea is cool, but like I said, it's just not anything as new or innovative as new life setting the balance, invalidating death. Or like with the fifth movie where killing someone kind of takes their place in your life. They ponder a bit in this movie, like I mentioned, and some of that stuff's a bit interesting because I feel like they don't do enough in this franchise sometimes to address how these characters are feeling about the uncertainty of death, the unfairness of it, but it is a bit surface level. And this movie doesn't have what's going for it what the first movie did. The first one, you had this mystery of what was going on, and you learn the information along with the characters. In this one, you know, you've seen it twice, like I said. So all you're getting is kind of just this rehashed version of them piecing together the information, looking up news articles of what happened in the first 2 movies, and then figuring out that way. It leaves you with that final destination feeling at the end, which I like, but the third act just overall feels a little bit rushed. And it also has this thing that bothers me a little bit about this franchise, which is, you know, when a character is monologuing in front of something big or something obvious, they're having this scene where they're like, I am not going to die today or whatever, and then something falls and crushes them or something happens to them. You know what I'm talking about, I feel like, when the character is having this blow up moment about them not dying or how they've beaten death, something like that, and then something comes along and kills them immediately. And it can be darkly comedic, but I feel like at this point it's just been overused in the franchise, and it's one of the things where it's like, as soon as I see it start to happen, I know exactly where they're going, and I know the character's dead. As a whole, this is a Final Destination movie that I definitely find very watchable, find very enjoyable, but just have some gripes with and find to be probably the most generic. Not the worst, but the most generic. But it is saved by delivering on some of that Final Destination classic stuff that I come to these movies to watch. I'm not going into this looking for The Godfather or anything. And it delivers on the kills. They're good. They have great set pieces, and I like Mary Elizabeth Winstead, so I like this movie. It just feels like when I'm reviewing this movie, I could speak a lot more about the problems I had with it and the negatives rather than the positives, because a lot of my positives are kind of just surface level commentary on what I like about this franchise overall rather than what I like individually about this movie, because the things that I like about this movie aren't things that I individually like about this movie. It's just things getting delivered that I come to expect from the Final Destination franchise that I enjoy. So it's not the first one that I pick up off the shelf when I'm in the mood to watch one of these, but it's definitely not one that I close to even dread watching. I think it's pretty fair to say that the most hated and least liked of the Final Destination franchise is the fourth movie. It's the most widely mocked, and I think for pretty decently good reasons. It's honestly a very easy movie to make fun of for a wide range of reasons. This came out when the 3D gimmick was at the height of its craze. Every movie was either getting post-converted or just getting released in 3D because they wanted to grab a couple extra bucks. And with Avatar and Coraline, it just seemed like the wave at the moment. I actually think this movie might have come out before Avatar, but could be wrong. But this also had an issue of very shitty script writing, very shitty acting, and because the franchise went full on in the CGI category, it just made it the worst looking one of these. I mentioned previously in the Final Destination 3 review that my issue with that movie was that, for better or worse, it just blended in with the rest and it made it a bit more generic, despite not having any of the mass fumblings that this movie does. But this is the movie that has those fumblings, and although it does look unique, it looks very much different from the first three, that's because it looks worse. Every character is very much a caricature or stereotype in this movie. They say all of the expected lines that you would expect characters like this to say. You know, the jock says pretty douchey things. The main character is the one who takes everything seriously, and, you know, his girlfriend goes along with it and stuff. You have some sympathetic characters. You have some very horrendous characters that definitely get the death that they deserve. And it's kind of by design that way so that you can kind of enjoy it without feeling bad about it. And all of these things can be true, but at the same time, I still think this movie is at the very least entertaining. Very much a movie that you could just watch. And like I said with the last one, although this one is much worse than the third one, I think 3 is still a decent movie. This one's not. But it's okay, it wears it on its sleeve, and all of its flaws make it somewhat more entertaining, because just a generic fourth Final Destination movie where they do all the same things would have been a lot less memorable than the way that they just fall down the stairs with this one. Is that enough for most people? Definitely not, and this is pretty easily the worst one because of that. But the franchise still kind of chugs along with a little bit of borrowed goodwill and grace because of how entertaining the concept is. So at the very least, it is an entertaining movie. This is a very entertaining concept. You can always find new ways to have horrible accidents happen to people, and even if the plot is paper thin as it is with this movie, you can still enjoy it. You can still watch it. It's literally only like an hour and 15 minutes long. It doesn't demand much out of you, but, you know, it's pretty bad, you know? I wouldn't be happy if I paid the $15 ticket today to go see it, but it's just part of the DVD collection, and with that, it's fine, you know? It's pretty horrid, but to be honest, there are much lower points in many other horror franchises. This is very much the low point of the Final Destination franchise. But as far as it goes, there's plenty of much worse lower points in other horror franchises. Most of the Wrong Turn franchise is worse than this. Half of the Leprechaun movies are a zillion times worse than this. This is definitely better than Jason Goes to Manhattan, and it's 20 minutes less, so what can you complain about? The worst thing that a horror movie, or really any movie in general, can do is bore me, and this movie at least has the mercy of not doing that. It's fast-paced, it's quick, it's entertaining, it's got plenty of deaths, although a lot of them look shitty, a lot of them are covered in ugly CGI, and they happen to very thinly written, stupid characters. That's fine with me, you know? It does still completely overplay its hand, though, and just falls flat on its face with basically everything that it tries to do to set itself apart from the rest of the franchise. And it's honestly shocking that this comes from David R. Ellis, the same director who brought us the second Final Destination movie, widely considered to be many people's favorite. As I posted before, I think it's probably people's favorite of this franchise. But the weird graphics that plague the main character throughout this whole movie just feels like such a bad choice, even forgetting the fact that it's CGI dog shit. It really isn't anything unique in the way that the second or fifth movie does. Basically everybody in this movie's a shithead, like I said earlier. And whereas the previous movies made for at least relatively relatable scenarios where things that are bad can happen, household appliances go wrong, construction things go wrong, at least things that are feasible can happen in those previous movies. This one goes all in on Looney Tunes with real life consequences, really improbable or even just physically impossible deaths happen that are stupid, make no sense. And it's basically all of them. The one that almost happened with the car wash, like, Jesus Christ. The one where the guy gets hit with the tank and it's enough force that it just presses him through the fence. Makes absolutely zero sense. The guy who gets sucked down the drain at the bottom of the pool, or even just the lady getting hit in the head with the stone that was hit by the lawnmower. These are things that never happen in real life, almost could never happen in real life, and they have to convolute these scenarios. They have to entirely fabricate and make up stupid situations that would never happen in real life. Looney Tunes scenarios with Looney Tunes consequences, but at least with a CGI effect on what would happen to a person in real life. And it's fucking stupid. It's just that with the first three, there's a lot of scenarios that allow you to feel anxious. They allow you to feel that thing of like, oh man, I'm never driving behind a log truck again. Oh, I'm never doing this again or stepping, They make you feel these relatable things to where it's like, okay, I guess I'm not doing that again. With these, I don't get that anxious feeling, It's not the same as getting on a plane or on a roller coaster. I am never going to go to a racetrack and be worried about, oh, is this car gonna flip and crush me and all these. It's like I said, it's that convoluted nature to it. It's so preposterous that I just don't worry about these things happening to me. And that deflates a lot of the balloon of what makes a Final Destination movie good. But it's still entertaining enough to where it gets by and I don't worry about it. If I wasn't reviewing it or thinking about it critically, I would just think this movie's stupid, but whatever, it's entertaining. Literally the only one that is minorly possible in this movie is relatable to you if you are a clan member. So I guess you don't have to worry about it if you're not that. And it's not like I entirely need probable, because this is overall in and of itself, in its nature, an outlandish franchise. But this one just feels so stupid on every level. Like, the thing that always kind of separates me from a movie is when it gets a degree of separation from the internal logic in the story or in the world that it's set in. As long as it obeys by the rules that were set and kind of meant to be followed, or just the way that it works and is shown to work, I have no problem going along with it. But this was set in a world where these things are supposed to be a supernatural entity, death, that uses realistic and freak accidents to kind of make these things happen. But there is a point where you're just stretching the logic too far. The things that are happening, the things that are already set there into motion, you just strain credibility. You strain my believability a little bit. And that really says something when you're talking about a guy like me who is very willing to accept ridiculous things in a franchise like this. But these are just so far from any kind of grounded nature that it just comes across a little bit too stupid to me sometimes. There's also, in this franchise at this point in particular, just a little bit of an edge of nihilism. It's just at this point it feels like it's almost too hopeless to cheat death. It makes the struggle sometimes feel like it's a lot for nothing, because in the end you die anyway. But whatever, this movie's an hour and 15 minutes long, not very deep anyway. But I like the idea that these characters could potentially escape death. I feel like, especially the first two, they harken on the idea that there is a potential way to cheat it or get out of it, skip it, whatever it is. I think dangling that idea that you could survive makes a lot of difference in your investment in the story. Otherwise, it just feels hopeless. And I feel like this movie completely just kind of settles down and is fine with the idea that it is hopeless, as it seems to be in this franchise up to this point. But at least it's entertaining, and this is not by any means a demanding movie to watch. It's probably a great movie to have beers and watch with your friends. You don't really have a story that you need to pay attention to, so that's out the door. It pretty much just copies the others, so you can really just tune out for the movie and then tune in when the crazy deaths happen, and that's all you need to watch out of this movie, because it's basically the only level of value that it provides on any level, if it does provide a value as an entry in this franchise. It's 100% the worst. It 100% does the least to really set itself apart from the rest of them, despite looking the most different. But it makes either the least amount of effort, or when it does make an effort to stand out, it does the worst job at it. But there's still fun to be had, and I'd watch this dozens of times before I'd ever watch Jeepers Creepers 3 again. So you gotta take that into consideration.
Look,
Like I said before, it seems to me like the second Final Destination has always been kind of the fan favorite. I'm actually pretty surprised to see a good amount of fanfare and love for the third Final Destination movie. That was the one where I feel like the franchise kind of took a step down, got a little bit more generic, got a little bit lazier. But it seems like a lot of people appreciate it. I think some of it is the deaths and the franchise kind of getting back with that original director. But I actually think I like the fifth one the most, though. Kind of talking in terms of the general consensus, it seems like this is the one that surprised people the most, though, because after how bad Final Destination 4 was, a lot of people just expected it to kind of get worse. That's generally how it is. It's a downward trajectory once these franchises get bad, until they just eventually crash and burn and are unsalvageable. But it seems like for the most part, and I'm definitely in this camp, Final Destination 5 gets back to what the franchise is great about being. And that fourth movie was just so dog shit that it wouldn't be that hard to make it better. Although, like I said, there are aspects of 4 I will defend as being a very entertaining movie despite how very stupid it is. But I will say this is the one that got the franchise back on track despite being the one that actually kind of killed the franchise for the better part of 15 years. It doesn't even really make sense to me why the franchise died after this. As far as I can tell, it's the second highest grossing of these movies. I don't know if it's relative to the budget that it wasn't considered a success. I mean, I just would have thought that the fourth movie, if anything, would be the one that would kill the franchise, not this one. But I even remember Tony Todd saying that they were going to film the sixth and seventh movies back to back. And this was like back in 2011 when I was, like checking IMDb on the school computer. Overall, though, I think this is a pretty clearly high step up from the fourth movie. There's still a few rough edges with the actors, stuff like that, but they are significantly better, I will say. And the thing is, too, even when with some of these characters they are a bit stereotypical or a bit caricaturish like they do in the fourth movie, they have those aspects. And the fifth movie does continue those, where you have people that are pretty much just cannon fodder for death. They're very much characters you're not supposed to meant to really care that much about, and they are a bit one-dimensional, but at the very least they're entertainingly one-dimensional or stupid. It's especially true with the few comedic actors that they brought into this movie, which are pretty well-known comedic actors. And I think that lends to the darkly comedic nature of this franchise, and just the fact that they have these misfortunes happen in such an insane way. They got the star of Fired Up, one of my favorite comedies of all time. So Nicholas D'Augusto is the lead of this movie, although he doesn't really bring any kind of comedic chops to this movie, which is fine. He's the lead. He's the straight man of this. And I don't think that he's an inherently funny person, it seems like. It kind of just depends on what role he's in. But then obviously you have David Koechner, who's very famous for a lot of comedies like Anchorman. And then PJ Byrne, who's also kind of a comedic character actor. He has a very funny part in Horrible Bosses that I always remember him for. But that's what I mean when I say that they have these comedic actors that kind of lend to that darkly comedic aspect of how death works in this franchise, how misfortunate things are. And they get a lot of really funny moments, even though they are a bit one-dimensional, like I mentioned. But at least, like I said, they brought in these funny actors who, can just kind of chew up the scenery for the little parts that they have in these movies. At this point, we're looking at, it's the fifth Final Destination movie. And this franchise at this point has no delusions about what it is. So at this point, they kind of just are in a mode of, let's go for it. Let's see how far we can push things. And as a fan of it, I like it. I don't think it goes as far as the fourth movie in terms of stretching believability, but they are insane freak accidents where they have the setup at least makes sense. They put them in dangerous situations where it's like something could easily go wrong. Gymnastic accidents happen all the time and they're pretty horrific. So what if we take that and amplify it? Warehouses are very dangerous. There's a lot of dangerous equipment, machinery, a lot of ways that bad things could possibly happen. So they play on that. And it has a lot of fun with the sleight of hand, the way that it kind of makes you look in one direction while it kind of makes death come from the other angle of it, the other side. Just delivering some gnarly kills in a way that can be very surprising and shocking at sometimes, which you kind of need to do at this point, 5 movies in, especially when you have a premise that basically is the same thing every time. You gotta find new ways to make things different. Pretty much all of the kill scenes in these movies, they very much rely on the suspense, the lead up, the way that these things eventually unfold, and I like the way that this movie kind of sets up alternate means to kind of make you cringe in different ways, think about different things, and then kind of pull the rug out from under you in ways that you don't really see coming because you see all the pieces of the puzzle, but until all is said and done, you don't exactly know how it ends up. And another up for this movie is they thankfully got Tony Todd back, which is always just the greatest sprinkling of a thing that happens in all these movies. He was just so sorely missed in the third and fourth movie that I'm very happy that that they did manage to bring him back in this one. He always brings kind of a presence with him, that presence of death. It's always so eerie, creepy, and I mean, let's face it, he's also just the best possible way that you could give exposition, dialogue, or information about death in a way that doesn't feel as kind of ham-fisted as it generally could and easily could. I thought it overall worked, but I mean, that is what this character does. He shows up, just kind of has that aura about him, delivers his dialogue about what the new rule is or what death is doing, and then just kind of pieces out. But I also think at this point, he's enjoying himself so much in this role that he can kind of give the best possible delivery that he does in this whole franchise. And getting back to the characters, yeah, these aren't the most compelling characters, but they don't really need to be. They definitely serve their context in the purpose of the story, and they get us to where we need to for this entry. They're likable enough, you get invested in their characters enough, so they just perfectly service the story in the way that, you know, you understand the dynamics, you like the characters that you're supposed to like, you don't like the characters that you're not supposed to like. It really is kind of that basic, which is okay. It's very much okay for a movie like this. But I also think that they realized at this point that they couldn't just keep doing the same old things, that they couldn't keep relying on the same old tricks, and that they needed to do something to mix it up. So they added this really interesting kill rule, which I was having kind of a discussion today in a group chat about how it works. And there is some confusing aspects to it, which is fair, but I definitely think that addition kind of freshened things up, added for a third act level of suspense that kind of changed things up. It wasn't just death going after them. I can always appreciate them doing something interesting, unique, or doing something to change up the formula of especially a franchise that is as formulaic as this one. But it also allows for a boiling point with the characters, which you couldn't really get before. Because, like I said, this one, the third act isn't just about evading accidents or evading tragedies. You have to evade this other aspect of a guy who's trying to get his life back. So you have a human threat at the end for once, which is definitely a big change compared to the rest of them. And Peter actively trying to kill them at the end is something that just actively switches the movie up. But the one thing that I really dig about this movie, and the one thing that I always remember about it, the thing that shocked me the most when I first saw it, is of course the plot twist. It is such a great full circle moment for this franchise, and honestly, like, it is a very cool place to leave this franchise on. The fact that, you know, that was kind of the ending of the franchise for a while. It's a really great badass way to go out. If it was the last, you know, I'd be cool with it, because that's a hell of a note to go out on. Just having it secretly be a prequel to the first movie, playing that sleight of hand like I talked about in terms of not just the suspense surrounding the deaths, but also the ultimate lead up into the fact that Sam gets on that plane with Alex, and that he ends up being in that ultimate tragedy that that first movie ends up being. And it's just an awesome way to end it. Very surprising, the fact that they were able to pull it off the whole movie, just mentioning this trip to London and stuff, without, I think, doing it in a way that really leads the audience into thinking what could have been very obvious, honestly. And maybe it's just the fact that it caught me off guard because I was 11 when I first saw it, but it's a great surprise. It doesn't really recontextualize the movie at all. It's not like a plot twist like in The Sixth Sense where the entire movie is different now, but it just makes for an awesome little twist, great little treat to the fans, and it makes it feel like a celebration of the franchise overall. But those are just my thoughts on Final Destination 5, why I think it's the best, why I like it the best. Let me know what you guys think in the comments section. I'm GM Light. Have a good one.